Mexico's border with Central America, as well as the border it shares with the U.S., has been a pathway for people, goods, crime, and contraband in both directions. How can Mexico address these trans-border challenges? What is the future of Mexico's relations with its northern and southern neighbors? How will Mexico's foreign relations affect its domestic politics? Welcome to today's program. My name is Ramonda Kleinberg, your host, and with me today to discuss some of these ongoing border questions is Sylvia Longmire. Ms. Longmire is a medically retired Air Force captain and former special agent with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. During her 8 years with the AFOSI, she conducted numerous criminal investigations and worked extensively in the fields of counterintelligence, counterespionage, and force protection. Throughout her last assignment, Ms. Longmire worked at the AFOSI headquarters as the Latin America desk officer. There she analyzed issues in the U.S. Southern Command and areas of responsibility that might affect the security of deployed Air Force personnel. From December 2005 through July 2009, Sylvia worked as a senior intelligence analyst for the California State Fusion Center and the California Emergency Management Agency's Situational Awareness Unit, focusing almost exclusively on Mexican drug trafficking organizations and southwest border violence issues. For the last 6 years, Ms. Longmire has regularly lectured on terrorism in Latin America at the Air Force Special Operations School's Dynamics of International Terrorism course. Welcome, Sylvia. Thank you for being on today's program.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we've heard much on the news lately about the rise of the Mexican cartel. Can you tell us what is going on in Mexico?
Sure. The cartels have been around for several decades. Actually, drug trafficking in Mexico started in the 1800s when the Chinese came over and brought the opium poppy with them. So they started to grow the heroin and the morphine trade, moving that from Mexico into the United States through places like Tijuana and then into Texas. Right. So the cartels got into that business in the early 1900s. And then as drug demand shifted and changed here in the United States, they shifted their business. So in the 1960s, they started transporting more marijuana. Then in the 70s and 80s, they started moving more cocaine and establishing ties with cartels in Colombia to move Colombian cocaine from there into Mexico. And they would be the transporters into the United States. And they became very good at it. So good at it, they completely overtook the drug trade in Central America, moving drugs into the United States. So now what's happened is that the what used to be just one family-run organization of drug smugglers and folks in the drug trade have kind of expanded. That empire was split up in 1987, and we've seen morphing of anywhere from 7 cartels to 3 cartels. Now we have maybe 5, and a couple of dozen other smaller criminal organizations that are focused on moving heroin, methamphetamine, cocaine, and marijuana into the United States and making money hand over fist.
So Mexico now is the hub where we looked at other South American countries as basically being that, like for instance, the Colombian cartels. Have they taken over where the Colombian cartels have left off?
As far as transportation, yes. Okay. Colombia is still, despite playing Colombia, despite all the money that we've put into it, and despite the reduction of violence in Colombia, production of cocaine there has not significantly been reduced or declined. So they are probably 90% of the cocaine that is produced in Colombia is moved through Mexico en route to the United States.
So they're working basically together in terms of getting those two to talk to each other and then move. Now, there's been an awful lot of violence associated with the drug cartels, and this was something we didn't really hear about in the past. I mean, the extent of violence, and even with innocent victims that aren't involved at all in the drug trade. Can you explain some of what the turning point was with these Mexican cartels?
The Mexican government, they had one political party that was in power for 71 years, the PRI, and they had an implicit arrangement with the cartels to where the government would look the other way and allow the cartels to more or less operate freely. However, the difference was that before 2000, if the cartel stepped out of line or did something that the government found to be inconvenient or too violent, the government would come in and make some arrests, some disappearances, throw some people in jail, and the cartels would do what the government pretty much told them to do, because that was good for business for them. So in 2000, when Vicente Fox was elected president and came into office, it was a change of political party. It was the arrival of true democracy in Mexico, and the government decided they didn't want to have that arrangement anymore. So they started to fight the cartels, and the cartels started to fight back. So it began kind of a slow increase in violence that the cartels wanted to keep doing what they were doing. Then we saw the infusion of groups like Los Zetas, who were former special forces soldiers who were recruited by a drug lord to basically form his own private army. Wow. And in 2003, 2004, we saw the introduction of paramilitary tactics, urban warfare tactics, beheadings, dismemberments, and that's when things really started to escalate because other cartels felt that they had to keep up or display other more violent forms of retribution in order to show that they were just as tough, just as violent, just as worthy of media attention. And things have just progressively gotten worse.
Well, this is interesting. So this is where you bring together, for instance, the drug cartels and then strategies utilized by terrorist groups.
Yes.
Would you distinguish them from the other? I guess, you would perhaps with the lack of politics on the side of
Sure.
of the drug cartels. But in terms of utilizing that type of violence, what good is it? What benefit can it bring the cartels but bad media and perhaps even more, more U.S. support, for instance, in trying to bring those cartels down? I mean, why violently eliminate, even innocent victims that are surrounding?
Sure, it's all for show. It has to be a display of power, especially when you have that level of competition for drug profits and the money involved. They have to show that they're the toughest, that they're the best, because they don't want their rivals. They're essentially sending a message to their competitors: don't mess with us, don't come in on territory. Also, they have control of most municipal and state police in the areas where they operate. So by having those displays of brutality, it's a message to the police, to stay in line, do what we want you to do. Same thing to politicians, because they need to show they're capable of reprimanding and punishing people who either rat them out or lose drug loads or incompetent, etc. And as far as targeting innocents, that is something that is highly disturbing. We see that the most with Los Zetas. And not being a criminal psychologist or anything like that, you can kind of only, at least I can only speculate on where they want to go with that. It could be a sociopathic tendency on behalf of some members of Los Zetas where they kill just to kill, or they want to just display their power and their capability. But they have to keep doing it. They have to keep showing they're relevant. They don't want to show that they're weak to anybody, to either other cartels or members of the government. They cannot allow themselves to show weakness, because that invites people to come in and battle for their territory.
Right. So if we took that psychological dimension a little farther, and even though neither one of us are psychologists, can we sort of assume that there's a glamorization now of these types of cartels, or being at that level of the drug trade itself?
Absolutely. I mean, the narco lifestyle is very glamorized in Mexico. There are narco corridos, as they call them. They're songs that are on the radio, on CDs. They've been banned in most of Mexico, I believe, that glorify narcos and drug lords and what they do and the people that they kill and the weapons that they carry. The way that they dress is, they're idolized by much of Mexico's youth these days, because the women, the jewels, the pimped out cars, the gold-plated guns, that's a very romanticized notion. It's almost like what in the United States, how we looked at cowboys, several decades ago. It's a very romanticized notion, because kids don't have superheroes in Mexico like we do here. It's the narcos that they look up to, because they have all the power in some places, and unfortunately, as the narco lifestyle becomes more socially acceptable, that makes it more challenging for the Mexican government to try to change the national mentality, saying that living this life is not only unacceptable, but it's deadly.
We still sort of glamorize it here too, don't we? I mean, the underclass generally has a path towards social mobility through the drug trade, where if they don't have any education, if they're from poor families, what other way is there for them to go?
as far as how far they will go with violence, they're much worse than gang members here. But you look at the gangster lifestyle, period, and some of the more higher-ranking gang members in the United States and some of the bigger gangs, it's virtually indistinguishable how they dress, how they behave, their kind of social behaviors. Very, very similar.
Similar, yes. What about the drug war itself? Let's talk about how we're dealing with it, because now we've got far more violent cartels that really have no shame, right? So they are moving very openly and doing their thing. We've got militarization basically at the border.
Yes.
Can we talk about that border now?
Sure.
What are we doing to try to stem that flow, and is it successful?
One of the answers that Department of Homeland Security is trying to put into effect is sending more money and more people to the border. There are currently more Border Patrol agents and Customs and Border Protection inspectors who are working on the border than at any time in history, and there also has been an increase in funding. However, we're not seeing any dramatic decline in the amount of drugs that are being moved. Illegal immigration is a totally separate issue, so I'm not going to mention that. I'm talking, I want to focus strictly on the drug issue for now. And we're seeing an increase in arrests on the Mexican side. We're seeing an increase in seizure as far as volume seizure, but the traffic has stayed the same. So that's part of the challenge, is finding out where is the right place to send these agents, where are the most active sectors for drug smuggling, and trying to kind of focus on that. But the challenge is that DHS does not have a comprehensive strategy of where those major threats are. So it seems like we're just throwing people and we're just throwing money at the problem without being very specific. I think that the communication between the field and the headquarters, I think, is lacking. But we see that, we see that in the military, we see that in law enforcement, we see that in corporations. So that's nothing new.
Right.
But nobody wants to look bad and say, hey, we don't have control over our sector, or we need more money, we need more people. I think there's a big disconnect in trying to figure out where the weaknesses are on the border and send the right resources there.
Recently, we had one of the border agents killed,
yes.
Was it? Now, can we talk about that? The infiltration of weapons, the proliferation of that into
Sure.
Mexico, and how this whole thing became sort of scandalous.
Sure. Weapons trafficking is arguably one of the most controversial subject when we're talking about the drug war.
Right.
The Mexican government, even though it is a constitutional right to own a gun in Mexico, by federal law, it is almost impossible to actually go and buy one. It's an extremely long process, and ordinary Mexican citizens, on the whole, do not own weapons. So the cartels have to figure out a way to get weapons in order to use to kill each other and shoot
right.
at the soldiers and the police and such. So they turn to the United States. In some cases, the gun laws in border states are very lax, particularly in Texas and in Arizona, but they get their guns elsewhere as well. It's a process called straw purchasing, where they hire a U.S. citizen, sometimes Mexican nationals, sometimes not, but they're U.S. citizens and they have clean backgrounds. So they send them with a shopping list into a gun shop or a gun show and say, here, buy these rifles, buy this ammunition, buy these pistols, and they run the background check on them and everything comes back clean. So they walk out with their guns and they hand off those guns to a middleman who hands them off to several couriers, and they bring them south into Mexico, and they're very rarely inspected, and because Mexico doesn't have a customs system like we do.
Right.
So Mexico is now awash with AR-15s, AK-47s, 5.7 pistols that with the right ammunition can pierce armor, but they're also using grenades, they're using 50 caliber sniper rifles, they're using more heavy equipment. So where the controversy comes in is trying to figure out where most of the guns, or where all of the guns are coming from. And it's a very polarized debate, because you have one group of people saying that the vast majority of those guns are coming from here, and we have to figure out whether it's legislation or law enforcement that we need to focus on to stop that or slow down that flow.
Right.
And there's a whole other side of the debate that says that only a small number of guns are coming here. We want you to lift gun regulations, because the vast majority of those weapons are coming from either Central America, remnants from civil wars down there in the 80s, are coming from Mexican stock, army stocks, and the police who are corrupt and giving out those guns.
Right.
And where the real problem comes in is trying to trace those guns. only a small percentage of the guns used by cartels are actually seized. And out of the ones that are seized, only a small number are actually submitted to tracing. The ATF is responsible for tracing those guns, and that's where those figures come from as far as trying to figure out the percentage. Where the scandal happened was that the ATF initiated an operation called Fast and Furious, where they purposely allowed 2,000 guns to go into Mexico with the intention of tracing them or tracking them, trying to figure out who the ultimate buyers were to go after the big fish. The problem was they had no measures in place to actually trace or track those guns. Exactly. And they never told the Mexican government. So once they crossed the border, there was no way to follow those guns. So they started turning up at crime scenes all over Mexico, and in some cases they were being seized on the US side. What really got the scandal started, or what brought it to the attention of Congress, was that there was a team of Border Patrol agents that were out in Rio Rico, Arizona, and they got into a skirmish with some border bandits. We still trying to figure out who they're associated with. It may be the Gulf Cartel, but they're still working on that. And one of the agents, Border Patrol agent Brian Terry, was shot and killed. And there were 2 guns that were found at the crime scene. The gun that was used to kill him was never found, but 2 of the guns that were found at the crime scene were traced back to the Fast and Furious program. So that's where things really started to get hot, and the debate kind of came back up. But the bottom line is, with Fast and Furious aside, because of the nature, it's a black market trade. The very nature of the problem tells us that it's impossible to know exactly how many guns are coming from exactly what source. Common sense tells me that because the cartels are profit makers, they're businesses, and they want to reduce their costs as much as possible. And the easiest, cheapest, and fastest way for them to obtain guns is to take a drive across the border, buy them here legally, and bring them in. But some of the heavy weaponry we know is coming from other places, because you can't buy grenades in a gun shop here. So it's a huge mystery. A lot of people are frustrated, and it's very politically charged. But I don't see any change in that anytime soon because of the politics involved.
Clearly, you can see with Fast and Furious what the problem was, that there was no tracking device or mechanism in place. So it was from the get-go bound to fail.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Now, what is the United States doing in terms of other resources, for instance, in trying to track drugs coming into the country? And really what I mean to ask is, is the technology that we've, is advanced technology actually changing the way in which drugs come into our country, and are we on top of that?
They're trying to expand technology a little bit, particularly with the UAVs, the unmanned aerial vehicles. They're expanding that program and sending more UAVs to the border. We've actually even used UAVs inside Mexico. The Mexican government has very, very quietly requested our assistance. And that has been very controversial, because the Mexican government is hesitant because of a bad blood and bad history between the U.S. and Mexico. However, the UAVs that the Mexican government has don't have the same capability as far as infrared and other types of imaging technology. So they're kind of borrowing ours, and they're extremely helpful. The manpower involved is reduced, and what they can find and what they can see in all sorts of conditions is really great. The challenge comes in if the UAV sees something, but there aren't enough agents there to respond to it on the ground, then they're pretty much useless. So it's important for the UAV program to collaborate with the folks on the ground to make sure that they're working together. But it's been very helpful. Tunnel detection technology, border tunnels, is one of the ways that the cartels are trying to get, or successfully moving drugs into the United States. 100 such tunnels have been found just in the last 4 years, and they're very, very hard to find because they're socked away in warehouses and they're in people's homes.
Wow.
People.
So they would build a tunnel from there.
Yep. Just a few months ago in Phoenix, I believe it was not Phoenix. It was closer to the border. But yeah, one person's home right on the U.S. side, and they just had one of their bedrooms and stuff. It just had dirt and rocks and everything piled up in this bedroom. So right into somebody's house. So trying to find those tunnels, they rely heavily on human information. But if anybody knows about the tunnels or finds out about the tunnels, the cartels often kill them because they're so lucrative. So they're using different types of sensors that go into the earth and use vibrations to try to find out if there's any anomalies. But it's not a homogeneous border. The rocks and the soil and everything is different in that 2,000-mile stretch. So they kind of have to it's kind of a trial and error to see what technology works best. The virtual border fence, that turned out to be a colossal waste of money.
Talk to us about the virtual fence. What does that look like?
It was a series of towers, cameras, sensors. It was $1 billion that was poured into putting together this virtual fence that they were trying to save money without actually building a physical fence where any kind of traffic would be recognized, and then that monitoring would be relayed to Border Patrol where they could come out and respond. Right. But the sensors would malfunction. There were a lot of malfunctions, a lot of technology gone wrong. And after a couple of years of trying to deal with the virtual border fence and trying to fix it, they said, you know what, this is epic fail. So they decommissioned the program, and it was $1 billion down the drain.
Well, what about the actual fence?
Another controversial topic. There's about 760 miles or so of the fence that are completed, and it looks very different. I've seen the border fence in many different areas along the border, and the fence kind of has to be different, again, because the border's not homogeneous, and you have sandy areas, rocky, mountainous, and like in South Texas, the river, it's a big squiggle, so you cannot follow the river. You have parts of South Texas where the fence, there's as much as a mile of territory between the river and the fence where U.S. citizens have homes, have farms, so it's kind of a no man's land, and they feel like they're in danger because they don't know if Border Patrol will respond fast enough, if their land is trespassed, if it's violent drug smugglers with guns and go to burglarize their home. It's a really scary situation. Then there are other places like San Diego where the border fence works extremely well. They have paved roads now. I think it's only about 2 years old that they finally finished the double layer fence. Stadium lighting and cameras where the agents can respond in 2 minutes or less. So in places like that, it really works. But then you have expanses where there is no fence. And there are places where I believe you don't need a fence because not even desert critters are out there. It's so inhospitable. You don't have a lot of foot traffic, drug smugglers or immigrants, either one. So it's expensive. It's very expensive to build a fence. So just to say we're going to fence the border just to fence the border, well, that's our tax dollars we're talking about. You got to be smart about where you spend that money. But I believe the fence is effective as a deterrent. It will not stop anybody, and it's not designed to stop anybody. It's designed to slow them down long enough for Border Patrol to respond.
Let's talk about the issue of corruption and how that might continue to fuel the drug trade, as it were, because you've got paramilitary that are now making up the drug cartels, right? Especially the violent ones. And then where does the Army or the DEA or their equivalent come in? And have they been bought, or can they be bought?
Sure. Corruption goes back in Mexico and in all of Latin America for centuries. And sometimes I think it's difficult for Americans and even members of our own government to understand why Mexico is having such a hard time cleaning up their police forces and their government. It's, just arrest them, throw them in jail. There's very little transparency in Mexico, and corruption is a part of civil society. It's been that way for centuries, and folks don't understand that that's just how it works. There are many parts of Mexico that are poor. Civil servants don't get paid a lot of money. So bribery and corruption is just a way for money to kind of trickle down, keep people happy, keep any kind of coups or revolts from happening, and it's socially acceptable. And a lot of folks don't get that here because that's not how we do business. We publicize all corruption on TV. So fighting that is just an uphill battle. President Calderon has fired entire police forces, dozens to hundreds of police, throw them out and bring in polygraphed and tested, clean, new officers. But the way that things operate on the street is plata o plomo, silver or lead, take the bribe or take the bullet. So even if you install an entire new police force, fresh out of training, fresh out of testing, they're still not getting paid a lot of money. And it's within a matter of weeks, if not days, before they're threatened by the cartel saying, if you don't do things the way we want and accept our money, then guess what? We'll put a couple of bullets in your head and your kids and your wife. So the nature of the drug war makes it so difficult to try to battle that corruption. Now, we're not immune. We have seen a rise in the number of corruption cases brought against CBP, Border Patrol, and not just the feds. We're seeing sheriffs that are being arrested, local law enforcement agents, because just the amount of money is very hard to turn away from. The economy is pretty bad, and agents with these that work for these agencies and police officers, they have problems too. If they're going through a divorce or gambling problem, and the money is kind of hard to look away, and it's kind of a victimless crime for some in some minds. Like, all I have to do is just let when this car comes, and just let them go.
Right.
And we're only catching 10% of the drugs that are coming across. So what's one more car? Or what's 3 more or 4 more illegal immigrants, and I'm getting paid however many thousands of dollars.
Right. And I imagine that if you work in the trade, not in the trade per se, but if you work in the field, you see it as overwhelming, and that you're just a drop in the bucket if you take this money, because you're not going to definitely stop it.
Right.
So it becomes in and of itself a problem that balloons.
Sure.
Now let's talk about your book here. You've written the Coming Invasion of Mexico's Drug Wars Cartel. Can you tell us about it?
Sure. Essentially, it's a Drug War 101 book. I've been writing a blog for almost 3 years now, that what I like to do is take news stories that are out there about the drug war, break them down and explain to folks in just everyday language, using my experience, this is why this story is significant, this is why this is underreported, this is what this means in the overall context, because I'm an analyst, that's what I do. And I had built such a collection of blog posts. I'm also a correspondent for Homeland Security Today magazine, and a lot of stories about the drug war for them and other outlets. And I said, you know what, there is a lot of hunger out there in the American public for what the meaning of what's happening in Mexico. Well, how does it affect me? Should I care? And I believe it's having a profound impact on our national security, and that folks that live in Illinois and Idaho and Massachusetts, obviously far away from the border, they're being impacted and they don't know. So I wanted a vehicle to kind of explain, this is what's happening, this is why it's happening, these are the players that are involved, but more importantly, this is how it affects you. This is how it affects you, everyday American, because the cartels are operating in one way, shape, or form in over 1,000 U.S. cities. 90% of the illegal drugs that are being consumed here in the United States come from Mexico. They're using stash houses in our communities, middle-class communities, cul-de-sacs where kids are playing, and the houses, they're not run down, they're not in bad neighborhoods. They look like any other house in a development, and there'll be kids riding their bikes, and then one little house where strange people are coming and going, and that's where the drugs are being stored to be moved somewhere else. And as an American, knowing that kind of activity could be happening in my community, that concerns me. Right. So the bottom line of my book is, this is how it's affecting our national security, but more importantly, as an American, this is why you should care about what's happening there.
Interesting. So what do you think the solution is, Sylvia?
Well, we have the easy solutions and the hard solutions. The obvious solutions would be to either end drug demand in the United States, which we all know how practical that is, or completely legalizing from bottom to top the illegal drugs that are being trafficked by the cartels, meaning production of the growth of the opium poppy, the growth of the marijuana plant, all the way to smoking the joint, to injecting the drug. Completely legalize all of that, and for various legal and moral reasons, I don't see that happening either. Now, moving on to some more practical solutions, it's a cooperative effort. We have things that we need to do here, and there are things that the Mexican government needs to do. The biggest recruitment pool right now for the cartels is the young folks in Mexico. Right. Many of them are poor. Many of them have very few, if no, educational opportunities or employment opportunities. There is an entire generation of kids that we're calling ninis. Ni estudian ni trabajan. They neither work nor study. Some NGOs put it up to 7 million of these kids, whereas government estimates is like 300,000. Obviously, you don't want to acknowledge that there are more, because that makes the government look bad. So these kids, 12, 13, 14 years old, they're out on the street, they're not in school, their parents are divorced, they have a mom who's working 3 jobs just to try to keep food on the table. So up comes a member of the cartel and offers them $100 to go kill somebody, or they offer them MP3 players or jewelry or iPhones, and because of that glamorized lifestyle, they don't have any opportunities. They have nowhere to go. Right. So they're like, you know what, sign me up. Right. And that is tragic. So creating places for them to go, creating things for them to do, sending them to school and giving them hope for a future is one of the most fundamental ways to stop that. Looking at the corruption issue, going after the money. Mexico has very weak anti-money laundering laws because so much of the Mexican GDP is coming from illegal sources. So cutting off that funding again, very, very challenging and very politically heated. So going after the money. On our side, smart resource allocation, making sure we're sending the right amount of people and the right amount of money to the places where they're most needed along the border. And also continuing the cross-border cooperation that we have with Mexican agencies. It's the collaboration that we have right now is at the highest levels we've ever seen historically.
Right.
So it's great that the Mexican government is not only asking for help, but they're accepting it. But that's only just getting started, and we really have a long way to go.
Indeed, it's a compelling issue on all levels. Thank you very much for educating us on this.
Thank you for having me.